Young, who's going to talk with us about investigating the role of field portable geochemical instrumentation in planetary field geologic operations. Take it away, Kelsey.
Thank you. Okay, hi everyone. I'm Kelsey Young, and I'm working on this project as part of the RISE field team. So I'm going to be talking to you today as one of the first of 3 talks today that you're going to be hearing about the RISE field team and what we're doing out in Hawaii. Okay, so before I move forward, I want to define what we mean when we say instrumentation. We're not trying to argue that these instruments that we're taking out in the field with us are any proxy for the precision and accuracy of laboratory instruments. What we're talking about here is taking these field portable instruments out in the field and investigating what they could tell us real time about the science of that field site and how those instruments might fit into an operational concept of a planetary surface field geology mission. So one thing that we want to reinforce today is that these field portable instruments influence not only sample collection, and what I mean when I say that is sample high grading. What samples do we actually want to bring back to the surface of the Earth? But we're also advocating that these instruments can, and the in situ data analysis associated with them, can inform real-time traverse activities. And I'm going to talk to you today about a couple case studies that reinforce this point. So in general, RISE Theme 2, which is the field team associated with RISE, investigates the relationship between in situ scientific analysis and the operational constraints involved when you incorporate working with these instruments into an EVA timeline. So specifically, I'm going to talk about handheld X-ray fluorescence technology today. Initially, this technology was developed for industry and mining. So it's commercial off-the-shelf technology that's not really been applied to scientific problems extensively yet. So the first thing we wanted to do was really spend a lot of time calibrating this instrument and to make sure that we have confidence in the scientific accuracy of instruments like this. So I've spent the last 5-6 years calibrating this handheld XRF instrument with a suite of terrestrial homogeneous basalts at the Johnson Space Center. So I actually take the raw counts developed by the instrument and convert them based on the calibration curves we've developed. So the first case study I want to talk to you about was based off of the Desert Rats 2010 test. And for those of you who are not familiar with the Desert Rats field tests, they're conducted in the San Francisco Volcanic Field in northwest Arizona. And 4 crews of 2 people each conducted week-long traverses, about 3 EVAs per day, geared toward collecting samples and just observing the San Francisco Volcanic Field. So each crew was composed of 1 astronaut and 1 field geologist. And you can imagine that 4 crews, 1 week each, they collected a lot of samples. So for the purpose of this case study, I'm going to focus on the week that I spent in the rover with Stephanie Wilson from JSC. Here's our field site. As you can see, there's a geologic map superimposed on top of it that was composed just by looking at aerial images of the area. So there was a science backroom team that actually created this geologic map based on what they saw on Google Earth. And we were traversing throughout this entire area. So you can see that the Black Point lava flow is clearly defined here on the east, and the SP crater flow on bounds the field area to the west. There were also a lot of other volcanic flows that we as crews saw when we were traversing over the area, but we were not really able to differentiate between these flows in the field real time. However, I went and from these sampling locations collected samples and used the handheld XRF to analyze them. And you can see that they clustered pretty distinctly into 3 groups. I just showed a couple example plots. I have a lot more data if you want to see it later. But when you actually go back and put these samples back on where we collected them in the field, you can see that they really do pick out 3 distinct flows. Obviously in the field, we were able to identify the SP crater flow. It's much younger and much darker than the surrounding flows. But the samples that isolate into these 2 flow units were not identifiable by any of the crews in the field, reinforcing the point that these field portable instruments can really have an effect on real-time EVA activities. So now the rest of the talk, I'm going to be talking about the RISE survey team, PI'd by Tim Glotch out of Stony Brook. And the overall objective of the field team associated with RISE is investigating the link between current and commercial off-the-shelf field portable technologies and how you might implement these technologies into planetary field geology. So here's a little visual that you'll see again later. You start with a science question. Here's a picture of our field site in Hawaii. And then we're investigating how, again, portable instruments can get at answering these science questions real time in the field with in situ analysis. And then we're taking the lessons learned from that and moving forward into operational recommendations for future missions. So my talk today is focusing on the middle bullet here. the actual incorporation of portable instruments into fieldwork. And then Jake Bleacher has a talk this afternoon moving forward into operational lessons learned and recommendations. So here's the RISE field site. It's at Kilauea volcano, the Southwest Rift Zone right here. And here's a picture of the December 1974 flow. It was erupted in about 8 hours from a series of on-echelon fissures showed here, and then it flowed all the way down, and it's bounded by a fault to the east. So the fieldwork that the RISE team is completing is actually building on 6 previous years of PG&G and MAMA-funded research to study not only the physical volcanology and the actual emplacement of the flow itself, but also characterizing the chemistry and mineralogy of the lava flow itself and the alteration products, which I'll talk about. So here's a picture from the site. Taking you back right here, the actual active plume from the Kilauea Caldera is just located right off the scene right here. You can kind of see the edge of it here. So the plume from Kilauea is flowing down over the 74 flow. You can see it in the back of the image. It's the redder, browner plume right there. So the overarching question is, how can this field instrumentation help us answer science questions in situ? And again, how do you feed that forward into operational recommendations for EDAs? So here are the instruments that we've taken out to December 1974. There's a multispectral imager that again is going to talk about at 1:30 today, and that the lead for that imager is Deanne Rogers out of Stony Brook. We took a ground penetrating radar. Lynn Carter from Goddard was out with us last year. And then for the chemistry and mineralogy, we had a Terra XRD and the handheld XRF that I've been talking about. We also had a LiDAR, and the PI for that was Brent Gary out of Goddard. And then we also had a kite to provide us with really high resolution image mosaics and DTMs that serve as base maps for the rest of our data collection, which I'll talk about. And if you're interested in seeing some really amazing kite data, definitely come to Jake's talk later. It's pretty incredible. Okay, so again, here is the December 1974 flow, the RISE field site. And again, the things I'm going to be talking about today are focused just in this general box that you can see right here. And that's kind of, we've covered basically the entire extent of the flow within that boundary. And this study, this talk specifically, is going to focus on the geochemical and mineralogical diversity of the flow. But another part of our team is looking at the actual physical volcanology associated with this. So again, just a couple of case studies to show you the types of things that the XRF can, and the XRF and other in situ chemical portable instrumentation can tell you. I'm just going to show you a couple of examples of the types of things that we're looking at. I don't have concrete data to show you because we're working it up right now for publication, but I'm just going to tell you about some of the things that we're investigating here. Okay, so I mentioned coatings to you earlier. You can see them in these pictures. They look sort of bright white or gray in these images. Actually, in the field, they have like a really interesting iridescent blue sheen to them. And we're trying to understand what these coatings are made out of. How do they form? How does the coating chemistry vary when you move downflow and across flow? How thick are the coatings, and how do they interact with the bulk flow underneath it? Initial data that I'm working on right now is that the coatings are enriched in silicon, titanium, and iron relative to the bulk of the flow, and we really just want to understand why and how these coatings form and how do they interact with what else is going on at 74. Here's the Sulfatera field site, and again for reference you can see that active plume right there. This image right here is actually a kite image that Steve Scheidt from U of A took with his camera on a kite, and you can see the Sulfatera unit that we're talking about right here. It's a thermally active area, and here's a picture that I took from the ground. And I'll show you basically what we did here was we had incredibly high density. I took about over 100 measurements in that vent area that I showed you. And the goal of that is high density in situ analyses of this thermally active zone. And we're completing mapping of these alteration products to overlay on top of some of these kite images and DTMs. Another kind of example of how we're using this instrumentation is sort of high density and high spatial resolution measurements. So you can see this image here. This is the edge of the December 1974 boundary with the older flow that it has been placed on top of. And what you see here, with my hand for scale, is a series of ash beds. And basically what we're looking at here is the volcanic history of the region prior to the emplacement of the 74 flow. So if you were a field geologist or an astronaut field geologist going to sample this unit, it's going to be really hard to isolate the number of ash beds that you would want to complete laboratory geochemical analyses. But with something like the handheld XRF, which is non-destructive and doesn't require any sampling, you not only preserve the geologic context, but you can get this really high resolution measurement to target how these different ash beds might be different and to figure out how many eruptive pulses there might have been associated with this outcrop. We also are not just doing in situ analyses. We want to go back and compare these samples with laboratory analyses to make sure we're understanding the chemistry of the flow. So we're collaborating with Stan Mertzman at Franklin and Marshall and using his laboratory XRF and XRD. But I want to talk a little bit about what different questions you can answer with handheld instruments versus laboratory instruments. Obviously, again, we're not advocating that these handheld instruments are any sort of replacement for lab analyses. What we're saying is you can get at different problems with them. So again, I'll go back to the coatings. They're really thin and hard to Dremel off or to isolate in any sort of laboratory setting. So using the handheld instruments, you can really get at what these coatings are made of without having to worry about potentially complicated and time-consuming sample preparation. Here's another ash bed example. These are indurated ash sediments near that picture I showed you on the last slide. And again, these are really thin, but clearly different units here. And so instead of trying to isolate them in the field, especially if you're an astronaut who's worried about a lot of other things, human factors, constraints, etc., the handheld instrument is a really good and rapid way of getting real-time feedback in the field that could inform you about how these units were emplaced. So the last thing that I want to talk about is how you integrate these data sets together. So again, we took a lot of field instruments out there, and we're trying to play with the different data streams from those instruments to see how they can interact and work together. So this is that ash bed unit I showed you before with the XRF kind of for scale. This is actually a LiDAR surface texture, surface roughness image taken by our LiDAR team of a similar outcrop. And we're exploring ways to use these types of images as a base map for other geochemical or other types of data that we're taking. On the bottom set of images, I won't go extensively into this because Gen's giving a talk later today about it. But here you see a visible image and then a thermal image of the same site. And then right here, you can see these are the cal targets that camera team uses for their instrument. And I'm taking calibration XRF measurements in the field of view that they have taken that thermal and multispectral data from to kind of get a geochemical calibration set for them. So we're really, the RISE team is really interested in investigating these data products and see how we can integrate them real time to inform an astronaut about the geologic context of the area they're looking at. So I'll leave this up. The RISE team, again, we're interested in figuring out what is the ideal set of instruments you would want to effectively and efficiently investigate the geochemistry and geology of an area without being too detrimental to an EVA timeline. And some of the geochemical science themes that the RISE team's looking at December 1974 are these alteration coatings. We're doing detailed and high-res in-situ geochemical and mineralogical mapping, and we're looking at what types of data products we can generate and what different data streams we can combine to create a usable data product. And I'll take questions, but before I do, come see Gen and Jake's talk this afternoon in this room. Thanks.
We have time for a couple of questions.
Just a very quick question. Rachel Tillman with the Viking Mission Preservation Project. Are you aware of the heritage that comes from Viking and the experts that are still currently working in the field using the first X-ray fluorescence unit that was deployed on the Viking missions in 1975, 76?
Yeah, I've definitely read some of those papers.
Talk to me if you want more details on the
great.
instrumentation and the people involved.
That would be great, yeah.
Hey, Kelsey. Paul Abel, NASA Johnson. So one of the things that you alluded to, but I think would be very interesting, is your feelings on the use of these tools, handheld tools, to help you select the samples for return. Because return mass is everything, right, in terms of these missions. So could you comment on that?
Yeah, so to me, we've done a lot on that, especially when I was working with Cindy at JSC, obviously. We spent a lot of time looking at that. For the RISE project, we're looking more at how to incorporate them into an EVA and what effect that has on the operational timeline. But that, I mean, I think the number one use of these instruments is high grading. And especially if you look at a mission architecture that has you at a body for longer than just a couple hours, I think there is a huge potential for these instruments. I mean, the astronaut, when they're not on their 8 or whatever hour